Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to talk about Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas, the famous 13th century theologian and philosopher. Probably, in my opinion, he is the most famous medieval philosopher, with St. Augustine coming in as number two. Both Aquinas and Augustine, have significant influence on modern Catholic teaching today. But Aquinas is one that a lot more people have heard about outside of, the Catholic sphere, particularly due to his five ways of knowing God, which, even many non-philosophical people have probably seen a YouTube video, trying to disprove God. With that being said, let's dive on in. This is what we're going to cover. We'll talk a little bit about Aquinas. We'll talk about Aquinas' view on knowledge and the law. We'll talk about his views on virtue. And we'll talk about the five ways of knowing God according to Aquinas. Aquinas himself actually studied under Albert Magnus, or Albert the Great, or Albertus Magnus, depending on, where you're reading it. He was another Dominican friar, and Aquinas really was influenced very heavily by Magnus. Aquinas come from a somewhat well-to-do family, and when he decided that he was going to become a Dominican, his family was not pleased with that because they felt that would hurt their political position, because, the life of a Dominican is dedicated to study and poverty, and his family was very desiring to increase their wealth and position. So with Aquinas wanting to do that, they tried to stop him. They even went and basically kidnapped him and held him for like a year until, he did convince them that he really genuinely wanted to be a Dominican friar. His most famous works are Summa Theologica and Summa Contra Gentiles. Now, you will sometimes see Summa Theologica also called Summa Theologiae, or Theologiae. It just depends on the specific translator. And most copies of the Summa Theologica are very, they're abridged, or they have parts cut out. This is, the complete unabridged version, right? It's about 1,200 pages of rows and rows of tiny, tiny text, right? And supposedly, the Summa Theologica is everything that a Christian needs to know to start studying the Bible, right? So if you want to, start really being a Christian, you got to know all this stuff first. Summa Contra Gentiles is kind of the same thing. It's meant for the person who is not necessarily a Christian, and they're wanting to, perhaps are curious about the faith, right? I also have another one of Thomas's works, on being in essence. As you can tell, it's a lot smaller. But what I'm getting at with all this is that Aquinas was a very prolific writer, right? So I've just mentioned three of his works. But, complete works of Thomas Aquinas take up bookshelves, right? Especially when you start including many of his letters, his epistles that, he wrote to other people about topics which are held to be almost as good as a church teaching, right? Because of the huge influence his philosophy has, right? Basically everything this guy ever wrote was taken with extreme reverence and seriousness. Aquinas breaks down knowledge into two parts. We've got sacred doctrine, which deals with faith and revealed scripture. And part of this sacred doctrine for Catholics is not just the Bible, but what you'd call sacred tradition, right? If you are a Protestant, you've probably not heard of the term sacred tradition, but let me explain it out a little bit more, right? If we just take a line-by-line reading of the Bible, it will leave many unanswered questions about how a Christian ought to live or what they ought to do. So in order to fill those gaps, we try and look at like the first 100 or 200 years of Christianity. we see, okay, well, what were the earliest Christians doing? The earliest evidence for how Christians were living their life and what particularly they were doing. And then we try and bring those traditions forward in time. The logic being that the closer someone is to the life of Christ, the more likely it is they actually maybe met Christ or met the apostles, right? And that will give them a greater insight into, what it means to be a Christian, right? So that's what sacred tradition is. It's this carrying forward of the necessarily unwritten traditions of early Christianity. So that's the first realm of human knowledge. The next is natural philosophy, and that is dealing with knowledge through natural means. So I say this in my Phil 200 class, and I'll say it here today. There is a big misconception about a lot of medieval philosophers that they had no kind of respect or understanding of science. They had no desire to do science. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. In fact, a lot of the scientific innovations that we see coming through into the Enlightenment start out in the medieval period. But we have to understand that in the medieval period, they did not have the scientific method, right? So the method of doing science was the same way that Aristotle did science, right? You observe something and then you reason about it, right? And that was how you did science for 1500 years, right? We start seeing under Albert the Great, this idea that we should expand scientific learning. We should start doing experiments. We should start doing observation. And he's not the first one to really kind of say that, but he's one of the more significant ones. And we see this kind of respect for science and for learning of the natural world carried through in the work of Thomas Aquinas, right? We're all familiar with natural law theory as developed by Aquinas. Natural law theory was using the best scientific understanding of the time, right? It is my humble opinion, though, that if Aquinas had been living in modern times, post Charles Darwin, natural law theory would have been very strongly evolutionary based, right? There would be a continued respect for the role of the sciences and understanding the natural world, and we would see this reflected within natural law theory, right? So, but that's obviously a hypothetical case. That's not actually, that's obviously not what actually happened. But I go through all this and I say all this to remind us that when we're talking about, eternal law and knowledge and natural law and all this thing, this was the best scientific understanding that was available at the time. Until you start doing rigorous controlled experimentation using a scientific method, this is about as close as you're going to get, right? So we've got our two realms of knowledge, and what governs these knowledge are these laws, these three levels of law, right? Natural philosophy, all the naturally known things are knowable to any person anywhere on the planet. The sacred doctrine is only knowable to people who have encountered, the Bible or encountered, Christian missionaries or whatever, right? That's a thing that I got to make sure I'm deliberate on saying, is that according to Aquinas, even if you've never heard of Christianity or any of this, you're still going to be following the natural law, and you can learn a lot of things through the natural law just by your participation in the world, right? Whereas sacred doctrine, well, you learn that by going to church, studying the Bible, participating in sacred tradition, what have you, right? So there's three levels of law that govern the universe. There's eternal law, that's God's reason as known by God, right? So God has these eternal rules and laws on which everything operates because we live in a logical world with cause and effect and consistency, right? I drop a pin, it doesn't suddenly start flying off into space, right? And that's eternal. And that's eternal because God has kind of this blueprint or this idea in his mind, and he knows what that is. So, right, that's the eternal law. Natural law is the participation of the universe and all the things within it in the eternal law, right? So we know that if I pick up this pen and drop it, it is going to fall, right? We understand that's a law of nature, a natural law. That's gravity in action. What we don't know is why God has that. Why does this natural law exist and what is its purpose? We can pontificate and we can try and understand through reason, but there are still going to be gaps in our knowledge of the natural world and of the natural law because we don't know God's reasons as known by God, right? We don't know the eternal law. We just know what we can discover via natural law. And then finally, there are human laws, which are the lowest level of law, and these are human attempts towards a common good, right? So this is a law against littering, right? We understand if every person littered, it would turn the world into a garbage dump and no one would be happy. So we have laws against littering, and that's a human attempt towards the common good being our understanding of the natural law, right? Now keep in mind, for human laws and for common good and for natural law, natural philosophy, all these things, this doesn't require us to be Christians, right? We can be living out in the Amazon jungle, never heard of a Bible, never heard of, Jesus, any of that, and we can still come to understand natural law. We can still create human laws that attempt towards common good, right? Next, we have a type of law that's a sort of knowledge that we get, and this is divine law. So it is where eternal law is revealed to us via Scripture, right? So we've got covenantal law. Think of the Ten Commandments and other kind of covenants, promises, direct orders, right? Those are covenantal laws. Then we have the Old Law, which is the Old Testament. It is meant to show the corruption in our hearts and show our natural wickedness, which is supposed to show us how we cannot live up to the natural law. We are going to be flawed, so in order to meet that, we have the new law or the New Testament, right? And it is the life of Christ. It's this new psychology of man, a new way of living that is beyond what we understood before, right? And we see a little bit of this when we think back to Pseudo-Dionysus, right? We see this really sharp distinction between what humans understand and what God understands, right? So under human ideas of what's good, we get this, ideas of like people in power and the strong and all that, whereas God's idea of what's good is the meek and the downtrodden and all that, right? So we see this complete difference between what we understand and what is the eternal law, right? So that's, again, kind of highlights for us the difference between, our understanding of the world and the reality of the world, right? For anyone who thinks that perhaps our human understanding can really rival that of God's, a challenge for them might be to live in the way that Christ lived, right? Try to live that way. This is what Aquinas would say. Try to live that way, dedicated to poverty and trying to go around and help people and trying to lead people away from sin and temptation, not pursuing things of this world, trying to love your neighbor and trying to help all those people. And you'll find in our modern world it is very hard to do that. It's almost impossible to do that, right? And part of that is the shape of the economy. Part of that is the shape of society. But we see that it is much more difficult to kind of live that way, to follow this new psychology, than what any of us like to admit. So that is the realms of knowledge, the law that governs the universe, and then divine laws revealed to us. Now, we've had divine laws revealed to us, and we've got natural law, and the next question we might ask is, well, how do we actually live in accordance with the natural law and live in accordance with, this new psychology, this new law brought forth by Christ, right? And Aquinas is going to say, well, first we try and live in a virtuous way, right? We're going back to virtue ethics. We've got 4 cardinal virtues: temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice. Each one of those will apply to the different situations we find ourselves in, and we try to face them as much as we can. So courage is, for example, the courage of many of these early Christians to literally face martyrdom, right? Temperance is the avoidance of things such as addictance or, lust or whatever. Wisdom, to seek knowledge and to pursue godliness, right? And then justice, which is to set ourselves away from our natural inclinations to do bad and to seek towards a higher version of right and wrong, right? We often want to get revenge or whatever, but we have to look to, for Aquinas, we have to look to what God wants us to do, and that is to follow, divine justice, whatever that might be. And then there are 3 theological virtues that are meant to bring us closer to Christ. These are the things that, again, we look back, right? We got the old law and the new law. The cardinal virtues really tend to apply to the old law. The theological virtues tend to apply to the new law, right? So we've got faith in God. We've got hope for the coming of Christ. And then we've got charity, which is a key part of trying to live the life of Christ, which is the abstainment from material goods and the desire to help those people in need. Changing gears a little bit, we'll talk about the 5 ways of knowing God. And these 5 ways of knowing God, in many ways, when we hear Aquinas talking about God, he's going to sound a bit Neoplatonist and he's going to sound a bit Aristotelian. So we're going to see a little bit of back and forth in the works of Aquinas. But a lot of these different YouTubers, like YouTube atheists, they'll say, oh, I disproved, Aquinas' 5 ways. I gotcha. Christians, you can't believe anything like that because I proved it wrong, right? But Aquinas isn't necessarily saying that this is the definitive proof for the existence of God. He's just saying that these are naturalistic ways, using natural philosophy, right, that we could come to know God exist. And he doesn't say they're the only ways. He even says that in the Summa, right? Now, some of you might wonder, well, why would we even focus on trying to prove the existence of God? Well, Aquinas and a lot of medieval thinkers felt that proving the existence of God wasn't so much a question of theology as much as it was of logic, right? This, whether or not God exists, is not something that we determine through faith. Faith tells us, how to live in accordance with God, but logic shows us that there is a God, right? And that's what Aquinas is trying to say, right? So if you go through these 5 arguments, these 5 ways of knowing God, this still doesn't get you to the Christian God, right? It still doesn't get you to like, oh, and that's why, God flooded the earth or whatever. It just says, if you go through all of these, just says, okay, well, using logic, I've come to this conclusion that there is a higher sort of being than us. And that's it. That's as far as you get, right? So let's start going into these with a bit of detail. So we got motion or change, causation, contingency, degrees, and teleological. And let's go through them with a little bit more detail. So the argument for motion. Now, in many ways, this seems like a very simple argument, right? So everything's in motion, and there must have been an unmoved mover to set everything in motion. But we'll see that this is a lot closer to his argument from causation than it is to just an argument of movement, right? And what that means is that it's not just that things are in motion, it's that motion exists, right? So there is motion. We see motion in the world, and everything that's moving was caused by something else moving. And it's not just motion, thinking, existence, right? Like all these things, it's not just like moving back and forth. It's this whole kind of cycle of life, right? Aquinas says, there must have been an unmoved mover to set everything in motion, because if not, it would be an infinite regress. Now, to us in modern times, the idea of an infinite regress doesn't sound, whatever. We've come to, understand and abide by the idea of infinity, but to a medieval thinker or an ancient thinker, infinity was like a logical contradiction. Nothing can be infinite to them. So if something results in an infinite regress, then it's an invalid argument, right? So this argument from motion, same with causation and contingency, these are all kind of relying on the same piece that, well, you can't have an infinite regress, right? So let's go on to argument from causation. The world is full of causes and effects, so there must have been an uncaused cause, right? Like I exist because, I was born from my mother, and my mother exists because she was born from my grandmother, and, we've got all these causes, and then we have these effects that cause these things, right? But if we keep going back, well, eventually we'd have to find something that was uncaused, right? Because again, we can't have that infinite regress. There has to be a stopping point somewhere. Then we've got argument from contingency or necessity. Thinking back to the causes, the world's full of causes, and whatever caused those causes must have always existed. Otherwise, nothing would exist. And what does that mean? That means that everything that exists had the potential not to exist, right? So we've got everything that exists, and we've got potentially all these things that could exist but don't exist, right? So there has to be something that makes these potential things into actual things. It can't just be a long chain of potential things all the way back. We have to have one thing from which everything else comes. Otherwise, we have, again, an infinite regress. Then we've got the argument from degrees or gradation. Some things are more or less good, therefore there must be something that is most good, right? And this is an argument that we encountered similarly with Anselm, right? We think back to Anselm. We've got things that are more or less perfect, more or less good, and there's got to be a most good thing, which all these other things kind of link to or come from or whatever, and that most good thing is God, right? Of course, it could also, I guess, hypothetically be the case you could have a most perfect thing that wouldn't be God, but under Aquinas' view, the most perfect thing is also the uncaused cause. It's the unmoved mover. It is the necessary thing that has always existed, right? That's the most perfect thing. And then finally, we got the teleological argument. Our world has order and logic to it. Therefore, something with order and logic must have been the thing that created it. This is the, famous watchmaker argument. You're walking through the desert and you find a watch. You wouldn't think, oh, this watch, come to exist through millions of years of slow iteration and evolution. You would think, oh, someone made this watch and left it here. And that's the teleological argument. Everything in the world has some sort of goal, right? Humans have an end, which is to reproduce and to, live in accordance with the natural law. Creatures have a goal to reproduce and to carry forward, right? Everything has a goal. Trees have a goal, right? All these things have a goal. They have a logic. And in order for all these things to exist, which have like an end goal, there must have been something that created all those things. And all those things must come from somewhere, right? So that's a teleological argument. just kind of a wrap up. I forgot to put a conclusion slide in here, right? So this is my references slide. Aquinas is, like I said, the most influential thinker of the medieval period. If you walk into a Catholic seminary today and you sat down to become a priest, you will be learning a lot of Aquinas, right? Like his influence still to this day impacts like 1 billion people worldwide. His arguments for the existence or for knowing of God's existence still impact people. You search on YouTube Aquinas 5 ways or Aquinas arguments for God, you'll find tens of thousands of videos made by people either arguing for the existence of God with those arguments or arguing against the existence of God, right? Now, we do have to keep in mind, again, Aquinas wasn't saying, go back to our 5 ways, he wasn't saying that this is the definitive proof of knowing God. He's saying these are 5 arguments that could help you come to know God. For Aquinas, what is the definitive proof of knowing God? Well, either God reveals himself to you, you get like a Moses in the burning bush type thing going on, or you receive like a Bible and you read through the Bible, you understand the Bible, right? Like that is the ultimate way of knowing God, but these are sort of a natural philosophy way of knowing God, right? These are ways that you could come to know God even if you had never read a Bible or didn't have any sort of religious experience. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot. If you're one of the students in my class, I look forward to hearing what you have to say in the weekly meeting. If you're a random person on YouTube, feel free to comment or whatever. So thank you. You have a great day.